Settle in. Get comfortable. Tuck yourself in tight. The fire is low, and outside, the wind is moving through the pines. That low, persistent hiss through 1,000 needles that sounds, if you are tired enough and the hour is late enough, almost like whispering. The unhallowed hour is upon us, and tonight's story is true. Well, mostly. The names are real. The place is real. The grave is still there. The cough woke him before he was conscious of anything else. It came up from below his ribs, one spasm pulling the next until the whole body had committed to the effort. One hand against the headboard, the other pressed to his mouth with the handkerchief his mother had hemmed. She had sewn 4 of them the winter before she died, the same blue thread she used for everything that year. The handkerchiefs had gone with him to Colorado and come back unused. He was using them now, 1 a day, the way she must have known he would. When the fit passed, he lay back. The room was very cold. Frost worked through the walls with that slow, periodic tightening of old wood in a hard winter, the sound a house makes when it has nothing else to do. In the dark, the linen was only a shape. The color could wait until morning. He set it on the bedside table. There had been no cough during the night. Not from her room, at least. The house gave nothing back when he listened. No coughing from down the hall. No breathing he could measure across the silence. Only the wind at the eaves and the elm branch against the east window, a sound he had stopped hearing in January and noticed again now. His legs were unreliable in the mornings. Hand to the bedpost, he waited for the floor to come back to him. The dressing gown hung on the hook behind the door. In November, when the cold began to take longer to leave his bones, he had placed it within arm's reach. He put it on now, took the lamp from the dresser, and opened the door. The hall was like ice. His father's door was closed at the far end, no light beneath the crack. George had been up before dawn all winter, hiding in the barn or the kitchen, or anywhere that was not his daughter's room. The door to her room was ajar. He pushed it open. She lay on the bed, very thin. Her hair was loose across the pillow. The lamp beside her mattress had burned down to a greasy wick. Her head turned when he entered, but she said nothing. There was no breath left in her for speaking. He set his lamp on the dresser, crossed to the chair beside the bed, and sat down. Her eyes met his, and he saw how little remained behind them. The sickness had hollowed her out. She would not last the afternoon. When he took her hand, it was the cold of something left out in the yard. He held it anyway. The silence in the room deepened. Outside, the gray light at the window held steady. He did not let go. After some time, her eyes closed. Whether she had fallen asleep or merely quit looking was not clear. He stayed. George came in at mid-morning. His eyes did not go to the bed. He set a cup of broth on the nightstand. The broth was not for Mercy. Mercy had not eaten in 3 days. "Drink that," George said. George stood in the doorway for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wallpaper above the bed, entirely avoiding his daughter. After a while, he turned and went out. The broth was warm in the cup, then warm in Edwin's hands, then warm in his chest. He kept hold of her hand. She died in the early afternoon. The gray light at the window had not shifted. Her breath had been very thin for some hours, a small, wet sound at the back of the throat that came and went and came again, slower through the morning, the pauses widening until one of them simply did not end. The moment could not be marked. The room had been keeping time by that sound for so long that its absence arrived as a kind of vertigo. He kept holding her hand. George came in some time later. He took the chair on the other side of the bed. He did not cry. He had a particular stillness he produced when there was nothing to do with his hands, and he produced it now. He sat very still and looked at the wall above the bed. A man in the room without occupying any space in it. After a long while, the hand in his was no longer something to hold. He let it go. He stood up and went out. George stayed. The kitchen was cold. The fire was out. He had neglected to bank the stove the night before, and the coals had died in the dark hours. The room held the stale chill of a space that had stopped being tended. He stood in the doorway. Her name formed in his throat, a breath half drawn to call for her, but he caught it behind his teeth. The body did not yet know she was gone. It still moved through the house as if she might be in the next room. The small moment of forgetting. The longer moment of remembering. He would have to teach himself, each time, the same thing he had learned the hour before. She's gone. It remained exactly as she had left it. The cup she had used 2 nights ago, the last time she had made her own tea, sat on the shelf near the stove. It was half full. A thin gray film formed over the liquid. His eyes went to it, then away. Her chair was pulled close to the cold iron of the stove, her blanket folded over the arm. It was where she had spent every night that winter. He sat at the table on the other side of the room. The fire stayed out. The kettle stayed empty. The cup stayed where she had set it. The afternoon thinned into evening. From somewhere above, the sound of George moving in the upstairs hall. A door opening. A door closing. Then nothing. George did not come down. Eventually, Edwin went back upstairs. The dressing gown stayed on when he lay down. The dark glass bottle sat on the table. The doctor had been firm about the measure, and the habit held. A spoonful and no more. It was bitter, but he swallowed it down. The laudanum took him slowly, the way the frost moved through the walls. Not unpleasant. Not pleasant. A softening of the edges. He slept, but he did not dream of her. He waited for a dream of her. The dead were meant to visit, but the laudanum offered only its empty corridors and gray waiting rooms, and she was in none of them. He woke to the cold dark and the heavy wrongness of an unanswered silence. That was what frightened him. The house was still. From the next room, there might have been the sound of George snoring, or there might not. He went down the stairs into the dark. The third step creaked as it always had. There was nowhere to go but through the rooms that held the shape of their life. On the landing, he stopped. The wallpaper there had been pulling away from the baseboards since November. He had meant to mention it to George in the early winter, but the intention had been overtaken by other things. Below the wallpaper, on the plaster, there was a dark patch that had not been there before. A dark bloom roughly the size of his palm that he was nearly certain had not been there the morning before. He raised the lamp closer. The wallpaper around it had gone soft, slightly dimpled, and when he pressed one finger to it, the plaster beneath gave, the way flesh gives under gentle pressure. No damage, no impression left behind. Only that brief sensation of something yielding that shouldn't. The wall was cold. The patch beneath his finger held a faint and unnatural warmth. He moved his finger an inch to the left. The wall there was as cold as the rest. He moved it back. The warmth came again. Not on the wall, exactly, but in it, radiating from something beneath. He took his hand away and looked at his fingertip in the lamplight. It was dry. Whatever the warmth was, it left nothing behind. He held the lamp closer, then pulled it back. The bloom did not move, did not change, and he could not have said with certainty whether the shape of it had been the same a moment ago. He believed it had. He was not entirely sure. After a while, he went back to bed. He did not sleep again. In the morning, he said nothing about the wall. The funeral was on Tuesday. The ground at Chestnut Hill was frozen too deep for a grave. The sexton said April at the earliest, more likely May, before the earth would soften enough to yield. Mercy went into the receiving crypt instead, a small stone room above the burial yard, where the dead were kept through the winter until the season could be persuaded to take them. The crypt door locked from the outside. The sexton kept the key on a heavy ring with a dozen others. Edwin watched him fit it to the lock, the sound of the tumblers falling into place unnervingly final. April was 3 months away. The house felt much larger than it had been. That was how it registered in the first days. Not emptier, larger. The hallway between his bedroom and the kitchen had a length it had not possessed before. The kitchen took longer to cross. The stairs required more from his knees. The rooms seemed to expand around him in a way he could not account for, as though the death had stretched the timbers from the inside. George was much smaller than he had been. He ate what was put in front of him. He spoke when spoken to. He did not weep, in the kitchen or anywhere else Edwin could see. The work was holding him up. The barn before light, the wood split twice, then stacked again because the first arrangement had not been right. The doctor came on the Thursday. He listened to Edwin's chest for a long time and told him nothing new. He left another bottle of the dark syrup beside the empty ones, a neat little row. The footsteps started that week. The first night he was not certain he had heard anything at all. The laudanum had taken him deep, and he woke in pieces, first his hands, then the weight of his own chest, and last of all, the knowledge of where he was. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. The house was quiet, yet he was certain he had been woken by a sound. Then he heard it. A creak, overhead. The particular groan of weight on a floorboard, very slow, very deliberate. Then nothing. Then another creak, a half step further on. The dark above him stayed dark. The footsteps continued. They went on for a measure he could not count because the opium had eaten the numbers out of him. But they lingered long enough that by the time they stopped, his pulse had begun to keep time with them. The second night, he lay awake waiting for it, his breath held shallow in his chest so it would not cover the sound. He pinpointed the source. It was directly overhead, not at the attic door, where the floorboards creaked when George passed. Further back, inside the attic, where there was no floor. The house had 3 stories from the front, but the third was only a peaked attic that followed the roofline, with no level floor for walking. The attic had been sealed since October. The boards in front of the attic door creaked when a body crossed them, but the attic itself had no floor. There were only rafters and the underside of the cedar shingles, and nothing in between. A man could not have walked there. A man would have fallen through. He listened, counting in the dark. 6 paces from one end to the other. The paces were measured. Whatever made them was in no hurry. Each footfall took its time. Each pause between them was long enough that he could hear the silence widening, long enough that he could begin to wonder if they had stopped before the next one arrived. A pause at the end of the 6. Then 6 back. Then another pause. He held very still. The midnight dose of syrup was wearing off, and his perception was sharper than he wanted it to be. Each step took its time. The ceiling did not flex the way it flexed when George passed overhead, and the joists made no sound at all. The crossings continued, a steady, unhurried measurement of the dark above his head. He counted 38 crossings before he reached for the bottle. The dose was larger than it should have been. The measuring was not careful. The cough was less. The body was less. Everything was less. That was the bargain. The syrup carried him under before the pacing stopped. The door to her room had a latch. The latch worked. Yet some mornings he would find the door a 1/4 inch ajar. He would close it, then close it harder the next day. until the act became a silent, daily argument with the house itself. He never looked inside. After that, the latch was no longer a question to be answered. The iron did what it did. The door did what it did. Each morning, the work of closing it was performed. Each morning, it had to be performed again. The mold on the landing had grown. It was past the baseboard now. The wallpaper above had gone soft in a patch shaped like the original bloom but larger, and a faint discoloration traveled up toward the ceiling, a stain coming through from the other side, like damp pressed out through old plaster. The discoloration traveled in the direction of Mercy's room. The wall outside her door was clean, but this wall, the one on the landing that backed against hers, was not. He traced the stain's path with his eyes. It was moving along the plaster, he realized with a jolt of cold, following the line of her room, but not yet crossing the threshold. He looked at it for a long time. He did not touch it again. He did not mention it to George. The smell came late one afternoon, sometime later. He was in the kitchen with the kettle in his hand, standing at the stove when it arrived. The sharp, icy vapor of camphor and soiled linens. Beneath it, a sickly, sweet smell, like fruit left to rot. The smell that had been in his mother's room before her, and Mary Olive's before that. The kitchen had not held this smell since before Mercy died. The kettle stayed suspended in his hand. The smell thinned, then vanished, leaving the air feeling scoured. For a long moment, he could not move. When he finally made the tea, he drank it standing by the stove, unwilling to turn his back on the room. The first cough came on a Thursday night, very late. He was halfway back to bed, the cold of the floorboards seeping into his feet, when a sound from the wall stopped him 3 steps from the mattress. The sound came from behind him, from the wall between his room and Mercy's. A single cough, low, brief. The wet, particular cough of someone trying to muffle the sound. The kind of cough Mercy had made for weeks into her own palm to keep from waking him. He did not turn around. The room was freezing. His hands had begun to shake. The skin along his arms had pulled tight into goose flesh. The hair at the nape of his neck was up. He stood in the dark with 3 steps between himself and his blankets, and he listened. The cough did not come again. He counted 10 breaths, then 20. The cold of the floorboards came through the soles of his feet and up into his shins. Somewhere far below, the kitchen stove popped as a coal shifted. From his father's room, no sound at all. After 30 breaths, he turned. The wall was only a wall. The lamp on his bedside table had burned low. He could just see the seam where the wallpaper had begun, faintly, to pull away from the baseboard. He got into bed. He did not sleep. Then the second cough came. He had not been doing anything in particular. He sat at the table with a cup of tea he had not touched. The light at the window was the dim gray of February, that slow part of the afternoon when the sun is past noon, but has not yet given up on the day. The kitchen was warm. The stove was lit. The cup in his hands was still hot. He had been thinking of nothing. A cough broke it. It came from the kitchen wall, the wall that backed against the hallway, the same wall the mold occupied on the other side. He did not move. Then the wet pause afterward that he remembered from her room, the small swallow that always followed. His own throat moved before he could stop it, the same shape hers had made over and over in the chair beside her bed. He waited. The kitchen made the small, orderly sounds a kitchen makes. The stove ticked. The cup gave off a small thread of steam he had not noticed before. The light at the window did not shift. The cough did not come again. He stood up, poured the tea down the basin, and put the cup on the shelf next to the one Mercy had left there. He woke at 3 in the morning on the Friday of the second week. The footsteps were overhead. He started counting. The first crossing was 12 paces, the second 16, the third 20. The room above him was stretching, the far wall receding into a darkness his mind could not map. It was walking the house into a new and impossible shape. The ceiling stayed where it was. After a while, the pacing stopped. The house went quiet. Whatever had been walking finished what it had been doing, and the silence afterward had the shape of something that had not left, only settled. Another dose of the syrup, larger than the last. The laudanum took him under slowly, the way it did now. In the morning, he said nothing to George. The footsteps came again the next night, and the next. The cough broke through the laudanum in the small hours. His fingers were blind as he swept the table with a flat, frantic palm until they found the dark glass. The dose he took then was reckless, a long swallow from a nearly empty bottle. He knew without looking that the 2 spent ones on the shelf would have a third beside them before dawn. The room was an oppressive temperature, and he was sweating through his linens. The lamp on the bedside table remained unlit. He could not remember why he had neglected to light it. The window was the only distinct object left, a small gray square where the moon lay trapped in the frost. He sank back into the linens, and as he did, the laudanum took hold, not in its usual soft way, but with the fever burning inside it, the 2 poisons mixing in his blood until the bedroom slipped its anchor. The walls were the color of a 3-day-old bruise, dark plum at the center, dirty yellow at the edges. The ceiling had receded into a distant vault. From the corner of the dresser, a shadow stretched long and sharp, a darkness so complete it felt like a hole cut into the room. This was not the room. A part of him knew it, a cold, quiet part that was no longer his. It watched the walls breathe. It noted the way the floor tilted and did nothing. The knowledge offered no comfort. He closed his eyes, waiting for the drug to pull him the rest of the way under. The scratching started then. A thin, patient scrape. A fingernail dragged across glass, slowly, with no urgency behind it. He kept his eyelids shut. The sound continued. It was methodical, devoid of intent, scraping long enough that he ceased expecting it to end. It went on past that point, and then past that. He opened his eyes. The window was silvered over with frost. There was nothing on the exterior pane that should have been capable of a sound, yet the scraping persisted. He turned his head on the pillow, a movement that took longer than turning a head should take. The laudanum had become the floor of a deep, black lake. He lay at the very bottom of it, every motion drowning under the weight of the water above him. His eyes found the center of the glass. There was a face on the other side. He could not see it clearly through the ice. The fever was a film between his eyes and the room, and the frost was a film between his eyes and the yard. But the face was there. It was pressed very close to the glass. The breath of the creature attached to it did not fog the window. He noted this omission with a cold, small notch in his mind, though he did not yet know what to do with it. It was a hand. Blue-gray fingernails pressed hard against the ice, one nail moving back and forth, scraping the frost away in a single, pale streak. The cleared line was level with his face on his own pillow. Whoever stood outside had matched his height as he lay dying exactly. The streak grew. The frost beneath it cleared. He could see her better now. The face was Mercy. Not the wasted Mercy of December, nor the hollowed Mercy of January. This was the Mercy of 2 years ago, who had pinned her hair up with one hand while doing something else with the other, who had never sat still in a chair if she could help it, who had been moving in some small way since the day she could walk. She was looking at him through the clean gap her hand had made in the ice. She had been looking at him for a very long time. Then he remembered that his room was on the second story. There was no porch beneath his window. There was no roof, no trellis, no ladder. There was only the clappered wall of the house, 12 feet of freezing air, and the deep snowdrifts below. Yet she stood there as though resting her weight on a porch that wasn't there. He tried to sit up, but his body had already forgotten how. The laudanum pulled him under. The fever held him there. Between the two, he had no more will than a drowned man. He tried to call her name. The taste came up first. Metal at the back of the tongue. The warning he had learned to recognize before the cough. Then came the familiar, hot spill of blood across his chin. His lungs were empty bellows. He managed only a wet, low rattle that did not even reach the bedroom door. Her lips moved. Her mouth shaped his name. Eddie. The lips opened wider than the word required, slowly, so that he could read it from the bed. The mouth held the shape for a moment, watching him watch it. Then it formed the name again, then a third time. She was in no hurry. She had all night. He closed his eyes. The scratching continued. When he opened them again, she had not moved. The hand remained pressed to the glass, the cleared streak in the frost now the width of his pillow, the width of his own shoulders. The fingernail had been scraping back and forth the entire time his eyes were shut. The motion had no end in it. He looked at the face. The face looked back. It was her skin, her hair. The hand bore the small white scar on the second knuckle from the nail in the barn. The details were all correct, but the sum of them was wrong. The distance between her eyes was a fraction too wide, her stillness not that of a person holding still. The cold in the bedroom had deepened. All the fever heat was leaching out of him, leaving the quilts on his chest as cold as the air. He felt the chill not on his skin but inside his chest, a frost settling against his ribs where the sickness lived. The scratching slowed. Then it stopped. The hand stayed flat against the pane. The face stayed at the window. He did not know how long she remained. Time had ceased to be an element he could calculate. The laudanum had eaten the hours. The fever had eaten the rest. He lay under the cold blankets and watched the still face at the window. It had no need of hurry. It would be there whether he kept his eyes open or closed. He kept them open until his lids burned, until the face at the window became a fixed point in a swimming dark. And then, in the space between one slow breath and the next, the point was gone. The window was empty. In the morning, the room was only a room. The light at the window was the dim, clinical morning light of February. The frost was intact across every inch of the glass. The frame was swollen tight. The latch was exactly where he had left it. He got up slowly, his legs unreliable beneath him. He went to the glass. There was no streak in the frost. There was no print of a hand. The ice was as undisturbed as the frost on the windows of the barn. Below, the snow was a smooth, unbroken sheet that met the foundation of the house without a single track coming or going. There could not have been tracks. The window was 12 feet up. He stood there for a long time. The vision from the night was a heat behind his eyes, but the glass before him was cold and inert. There was nothing to reconcile. There was only the window and what he remembered of the window. He turned back toward the bed. The dark bloom on the plaster had spread. It covered the wall just above his pillow now, a stain the shape of a splayed and reaching hand. He reached up and touched it. The plaster gave way with that same sickening yielding, like rotten flesh. It left no mark. The wall around it was freezing, but the patch beneath his fingertips held a faint, wet heat that seemed to throb against his skin. A slow, deep pulse from inside the house itself. He withdrew his hand. Mrs. Tillinghast came on a Thursday. He heard her from his bedroom, her voice and his father's low and careful. It had the distinct cadence of a conversation being held behind closed doors, meant to stay there. Getting up was a slow, agonizing negotiation with his limbs. Each movement cost him something vital. He managed the distance to the landing and lowered himself onto the second step. The angle allowed him to catch the sound without being seen from the kitchen below. He pulled his dressing gown tight against a chill that felt less like winter and more like a permanent retraction of his own blood. "It's what people are saying, George." Her voice was even, rhythmic, and practical. The voice of a woman discussing the price of winter feed. That the consumption keeps them here. That they draw on the living. Not out of malice, mind. From need. Like hunger. George said nothing. The silence from his father was heavy. The silence of an iron stove cooling down. "There is a way to be sure," she continued, her boots shifting slightly on the floorboards. "An old way. The body must be examined. If there is still life in the tissues, if the blood is still fluid in the heart, the organ is taken out and burned to ash. The ashes are dissolved in water and given to the sick child to drink. It cuts the cord." The pause that followed was long enough for the timber of the stairs to groan beneath Edwin's weight. "I know what people are saying," George said at last. His voice was rougher than usual, scraped thin. "And you know the boy is worsening." "I don't want to hear any more of it under this roof, Mrs. Tillinghast." "All right, George." She did not move to leave. Edwin heard her settle deeper into the hickory chair, her presence anchoring the room. Behind her, the kettle on the stove gave a brief, dying hiss. His father's chair scraped an inch back from the table, not enough to stand, just enough to put distance into the air between them. Edwin pressed his forehead against the cold spindle of the banister, listening to the quiet below. It was not the silence of a finished conversation, but of one abandoned, left to curdle in the corners. Eventually, the woman rose. The sharp scrape of the legs, the heavy thud of winter boots. The kitchen door opened, letting in a sudden, violent draft of winter air, and then clicked shut. He waited until he heard her footsteps crunching on the frozen crust of the path outside his window. Then he crawled back to his room. He lay on the mattress for hours. That night, she came again. He had taken the syrup at 9 and another half dose at 11. He woke at some hour that felt entirely removed from the clock. There was no scratching this time. There was only the face. She was at the glass. The streak her fingernail had cleared the night before was still there. It had remained through the noon thaw and through the gray afternoon. Now the gap in the frost had widened until it was the exact width of his pillow. She was looking through it. She did not move. She did not raise her hand to the pane. She simply stood 12 feet above the snowdrifts and looked at him. The gray wool coat she wore was stationary. The mouth was closed. The skin of her throat did not move with breath. He lay beneath his blankets and watched her watch him, until the laudanum took him under the way cold water takes a stone. In the morning, the cleared space on the glass had widened again. It was now the length and breadth of a headstone. George moved him downstairs the next afternoon. His father offered reasons that were not reasons. The heat from the kitchen stove, the cost of the stairs on his strength. Edwin did not argue. He saw the truth in his father's face, blank and hard as a headstone. George had heard something in the small hours, a sound he was not ready to name. This was an unspoken retreat, a move to a room that did not share a wall with the dead. George carried the bedding down in his large, split-knuckled hands. Edwin descended the stairs slowly, one palm sliding along the walnut banister, the other resting heavily on his father's flannel shoulder. He could feel the old man trembling beneath the cloth. The downstairs room was small and smelled of dried herbs and old brine. The bed was narrow. The plaster walls were clean, covered in a simple whitewash. The paper was not pulling away from the baseboard. There was no mold. Not yet. He lay down on the narrow mattress and turned his face toward the door. He did not look at the wall above his head. He could not say how long he had been in the downstairs room. A week, perhaps. Possibly 2. The days had begun to come apart at the edges, the hours running together, the syrup blurring the divisions, the fever softening what the syrup did not. The bottle was thinning faster than it should have. The spoon stayed on the bedside table, dry and unused. He poured straight from the dark glass into his mouth, counting the thick, black swallows by the drag of them across his tongue. The broth George brought in the mornings went back to the kitchen cold and filmed over, the mug mostly full. He kept to the barn most of the day. Edwin could hear the axe through the wall sometimes, and the cows in their stalls. The barn was 30 paces from the back door. Far enough. The downstairs room received the kitchen's warmth through the wall, and Edwin found himself drawn to it. He would spend hours sitting in the chair by the stove, staring at the grain of the floorboards. She came to him on a Tuesday. He was in the chair by the kitchen stove. The gray of a clouded morning sat flat against the windows. He looked up and she was in the doorway, inside. She stood between the kitchen and the hall, her wool dress a pale smudge against the deeper dark of the wainscoting. Her hair hung in loose clumps over her shoulders, face very pale, very still. In the half-light, he could just make out the dark veins blooming across her cheeks, fine and branching. Her hands hung at her sides, heavy and still. The thing had crossed the threshold it had been standing at for weeks. She did not move. She did not breathe. Then, without a shift in the air or the sound of a hem against the floor, the doorway was empty. A cold draft crept in and brought the smell with it. The medicine reached him first, faintly, the camphor that had been at the back of every room all winter. Then the sweetness underneath, heavier than it had been on the upstairs landing, heavier than it had been at the window. The smell of fruit gone past fruit. It rolled down the hallway and coated the back of his throat. He pressed his wool sleeve to his mouth. The taste had already settled beneath his tongue. He could not stop inhaling it. The townsfolk came twice that week. He drifted through the afternoon on the sound of voices at the front door. First, Mrs. Tillinghast, her tone a low, practical hum through the plaster, answered once by his father. Then a man's voice, a slower cadence that wore on and on, until the sounds blurred into a rhythm of negotiation. Lying in the back room, Edwin caught only fragments that snagged in his fevered mind. Boy, and then later, time. The word sister surfaced once, softly, asking a question he could feel the shape of even without hearing the words. The rise and fall of it went on, a tide pulling at the edges of the house. Eventually, the front door clicked shut. George did not come into the back room. He went into the kitchen instead, chair scraped back from the table, a single sharp shriek of wood on wood. Late that night, the sound of weeping came through the plaster, a short, sharp draw of air, then a long, stuttering exhale that broke twice on its way out. Small, wet sound of sobs not being stifled. Edwin pretended to be asleep when George came past his door. She came into the room that night. He woke to find the lamp was out, the room gone to shapes, the dresser a darker block against the wall, the foot of the bed an outline, the window a square of slightly less black. He could see her form, sitting in the kitchen chair beside him now. "Eddie, you're awake." He kept his eyes on the ceiling. "It's so cold tonight, Eddie." There was a sickly mellifluousness to her voice. Still, he did not look at her. "Eddie, Please, look at me. She had not said please in this voice in some years, not since they were children. The word landed somewhere in his chest he had not known was still open, and his head turned on the pillow before he could stop the impulse. She was in the chair still, hands in her lap, watching. "There you are," she said. "I just want to sit with you. I used to do this when you couldn't sleep, when you were little. Do you remember?" She moved toward the bed without him seeing. She was in the chair, and then she was on the edge of the mattress, and he had not registered the going from one to the other. The mattress did not give under her weight. She slid up against the headboard, smooth and unhurried, arranging a pillow behind her shoulder. Then she patted the place beside her on her shoulder, lightly, twice, and looked at him with the small half-smile she had used when they were young. He shifted across the bed. The cheek went against the wool of her shoulder. A miasma rose from the dress, heavy, settled. The kind of air that gathers in a sick room and does not leave when the patient does. It should have turned his stomach. The smell was the smell of his sister, and his sister was here, and he had not been held by anyone since their mother had died. Her hand came up, fingers mobile through his hair. They were so cold against his scalp. Moving slowly, combing his hair back from his temple. Again, and again, and again. "You used to come into my bed and put your face against my shoulder just like this. I would tell you to slow your breathing down, and you would. Just like that." She continued. His breathing slowed as her fingers moved rhythmically. Somewhere deep, he could feel a small, steady pull at the bottom of each exhale and a tightening with every inhale. The laudanum was doing its part now. "That's right, Eddie. Sleep." Her voice was very close to his ear. "There. I've got you now." She brought her mouth to the crown of his head and kissed him there. "I won't let you slip away from me again." His eyes fluttered one last time, the weight of a medicated sleep pulling him. The corner where the wall met the ceiling came into his view, and the rot with it. A black bloom at the seam, glossy where it was thickest, pale flecks scattered through it like spores of ash. He watched the leading edge cross the corner and start down the wall, not as a single line, but as many, branching, the dark reaching down the plaster in fine, veined fingers, each one finding its own path, each one slower than the last, but none of them stopping. The veins followed the small vertical crack above him and then ran past it, branching further past his view, toward her, or toward him. He could not have said which. Then the dark came down. The hemorrhage came on a night near the end of February. By the standards of recent weeks, he had felt almost well. He had taken supper at the table and sat by the iron stove for an hour, allowing himself the foolishness of believing the morning might be manageable. But the morning, when it arrived, came hours ahead of the sun, and it came with the taste of blood. He woke in the dark to something thick, hot, and salt iron surging at the back of his throat. Then came the spill, a violent, sudden rush across his chin. The cough tore upward after the fluid, a frantic, hacking spasm that did not stop. It went on for minutes, each convulsion ripping deeper into his chest until the sheet was ruined, the front of his nightshirt was splattered, and the air in the room smelled entirely of raw copper. George heard the wet rattling from the next room and burst in first. The doctor arrived an hour later and stayed for 2. When the doctor finally packed his instruments, he did not look at Edwin. He nodded once to George at the threshold, then left into the hall. That withheld gaze was its own finality. George followed him. The bedroom door did not quite close behind them. Edwin could hear the 2 men through the wall. Nothing more I can do, George. George said something Edwin could not make out. Keep him comfortable. The syrup when he needs it. More if he asks. How long? The doctor took a long time to answer. A week. 2, perhaps. I would not let the family go far. And the other thing, doctor? You know my position on the other thing. It is not medicine. I want that understood between us. It's understood. Thank you. The front door opened, then closed. Edwin could hear his father in the hall, the small, wet catch in his throat of a man trying not to make any sound at all. He had taken the syrup early. The dose was reckless, far larger than the doctor had ever prescribed, poured straight from the dark bottle into his throat. He lay on his back and waited for the laudanum to take him under, the way it had every other night. It did not. It pinned him to the bed and left him wide awake. The body had reached the place the doctor had warned him about back in November, when he had explained how the syrup would eventually fail. The body was past the dose. There would be no sleep tonight. There would be no insulation between him and what was already in the room with him. The dark moved. The shadows at the corners of the ceiling. Shadows he had memorized through fever and through stillness. Shadows that had been the same all winter, loosened from the plaster. They began to drift downward like black frost. The cold came in. The damp, heavy cold of a winter field at 4 a.m. The cold of standing outside in shirt sleeves, staring at a window, unable to go in. Her figure appeared before him. "Eddie," she whispered. He did not answer. "Eddie, look at me." He kept his eyes locked on the ceiling. "It's only me. It's only ever been me." The lie was so beautifully close to true that some part of him believed it before his mind could fight back. His head turned on the pillow, giving in. She was at the side of the bed now. He had not seen her move. She had simply occupied the space. "There you are," she said. "I've missed you," she whispered. "You don't know how long it's been." She bent towards him now, her face so close he could not take all of it in at once. The skin had the flat opacity of heavy parchment. Her eyes held no white. The iris had bled outward, a wet, uniform dark that saturated the globe from the inner corners to the rim of the lashes. Edwin had looked into her face every day of her life. The twin circles now staring back at him were a tenancy. Something else had occupied the sockets, stretching her features to fit a shape that did not belong to her. Her voice went smaller. "It's so dark out there, Eddie." She did not look at him when she said it. Her eyes had moved to the floor beside the bed. Her hand moved on the blanket, slow, looking for another hand to hold. "I forgot what it was like, the darkness." Then, very small, "Don't make me go back yet." Her breath hit his face. The breath was not breath. It was a slow, warm gust of the rot itself, no longer masked by anything. Wet, sweet. The smell of meat in a closed room in summer. The smell of fruit gone past fruit and into something else. The smell that had been in the upstairs hall and the kitchen and the corner of every room he had sat in all winter. Undiluted now. Arriving from the place it had been arriving from all along. The smell he had thought was hers. The smell was her. There was nothing else of his sister left. "Just breathe with me," she said, very soft. "That's all. Just breathe." The mouth opened. There were no teeth. There were no gums. The opening went straight back into a hollow depth inside her, a blackness of a different color than the dark of the bedroom, a dark with a terrible living depth. The sweet, rotten smell was at its source now, pouring out of her in warm, thick waves. His own lungs lurched in his chest. His body remembered being 5 years old and screaming in the dark, and Mercy in the bed beside him whispering, "Breathe with me, breathe with me," matching her rhythm to his until the panic let go. The body began to match its breathing to hers. He understood, with the small part of his mind that was still his own, what was about to happen. She was not drawing breath. She was the breath. The thing inside her mouth was what had eaten Mercy from the marrow out, and the only thing it needed to finish Edwin was for him to draw that warm, sweet vapor from her open mouth into his own. He pressed his lips together until his teeth ached. He held them. The mouth came closer, hovering. The smell intensified until it felt like a liquid coating his throat. His lungs were straining, burning. The body was starving for air, but he held his mouth shut. She did not seem to notice the refusal. She was still talking, very gently, the voice still perfect. "It's only me, Eddie. It's only ever been me. There's nothing in the dark but your sister. Open your mouth, sweetheart. Open it for me." The endearment was new. Sweetheart was a word their mother had used before she went into the ground. The thing had reached past Mercy, digging deeper into the history of the house, and it was using both dead women at the same time. He shook his head against the pillow. The motion was very small. The mouth came closer still. The smell filled his eyes, his ears, the back of his nose. His lungs were tearing themselves apart from the inside. The body was going to gasp soon. The body was going to betray him. Then came the hand. It laid from the side of the bed and laid itself flat against his bare throat. It was cold, a pure, radiating bone cold that belonged to 2 months in a stone crypt. The fingers shifted until they found the frantic pulse in his neck. She held it. She did not press. She did not squeeze. She simply held the pulse and counted it. "There you are," she said again. "That's my Eddie. I can hear you." The pulse hit her fingers like a desperate hand knocking on a door from the inside. She could feel the door. She was on the wrong side of it. His chest was on fire. He could not hold the air for another second. The throat was going to open. "Open your mouth, Eddie," she whispered against his lips. "Please, there's nothing left in me. Give me a little of yours." The lungs broke first. The jaws would have parted. The teeth would have opened. The sweet dark would have come in. The cough saved him. It tore up from below his ribs in one great hacking spasm. His head snapped forward into his own hand, and the thick rush of blood went into his sleeve and his fingers. He coughed and coughed, his body curling inward. When the spasm finally finished with him, she was no longer at the side of the bed. She was standing at the foot of the bed again. The face had arranged itself back into stillness. The mouth was closed, pulling at one corner, hands at her side. "All right, Eddie," she said. "Tomorrow, then." Then the room emptied. He lay in the dark with his bloody hand pressed to his mouth, the rattle still vibrating in his chest, and the icy impression of her fingers still burning on his throat. The sheets were wet. He was crying, though he hadn't noticed when the tears had started. In the corner of his eye, the small pantry window began to lighten into a pale, sickly gray. He did not get up. He did not call out for his father. The pines around him were dark and very still. The snow at his feet was deep, blue-shadowed and unbroken. He stood at the edge of the burial yard at Chestnut Hill, exactly where he and his father had stood on that Tuesday in February when they carried her coffin up the path. The men came up the road, 5 of them. His father was one, his head tucked low against the wind. The doctor was another. 3 more followed from the town. They walked with a slow, heavy rhythm, the 2 carrying the canvas-wrapped tools, setting their shoulders hard against the iron weight. The sexton was waiting at the holding bolt, his keys already chiming in his fist. The great brass lock turned. The iron door ground open on a frozen hinge. The men went into the dark. His father went in last. The door swung shut behind them, cutting off the wind. His vision shifted. He was inside the crypt. The stone walls were suffocatingly close. The cold here was different than the cold outside, a still, ancient frost that had settled deep into the masonry for the winter, with nowhere left to bleed. A small kerosene lantern stood on a low stone shelf, throwing a thin, yellow light across the room. The casket sat on a pair of wooden trestles in the center. Plain pine. The lid was still nailed. His father did not look at it. George stood flat against the damp wall, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The doctor went to the trestle. He took a short iron pry bar from one of the townsmen, fit the wedge into the seam of the lid, and worked it with a slow, systematic pressure. The nails came up with a succession of dry, splintering shrieks. He set each one down on the pine boards beside the casket as it came free. When the last nail had been set down, the doctor flat-palmed the edge of the lid. He looked at George. George nodded once, a single, jerked motion of his chin. The doctor lifted the lid. She was inside. Her dark hair was loose across the coffin's pillow. The gray wool dress she had been laid out in was unchanged, the neat, uneven stitches on the cuff sitting perfectly at her wrist. Her hands were folded over her breastbone exactly as the undertaker had left them. But her face was the color of the drifts outside. It was not the hollow, opaque pale of a body that had spent 2 months in the freezing tomb. It was further gone than that, translucent. A dense fan of dark, purplish veins branched across her cheeks. Edwin's eye knew the pattern. He had been looking at it for months. Where it crept through the plaster above her bedroom door, through the hall, above his bed now. The pattern was on her, too. The doctor muttered something to George, his voice a low rattle Edwin could not fully hear. George closed his eyes. The doctor turned back to the pine box. What happened next, Edwin saw only in fragmented pieces. The doctor's hands moved at her chest. Another man stepped forward, then immediately turned his face away, his shoulder blocking the lantern light. The doctor took a narrower iron tool, working it down through the stiff wool of the gray dress. The fabric resisted with a sharp snap of thread, and then it yielded. The doctor's forearms disappeared into the casket. Edwin's eye refused to settle on the work. A dense fan of dark, purplish veins branched across her cheeks. Edwin's eye knew the pattern. He had been looking at it for months. Where it crept through the plaster above her bedroom door, through the hall, above his bed now. The pattern was on her, too. The doctor muttered something to George, his voice a low rattle Edwin could not fully hear. George closed his eyes. The doctor turned back to the pine box. What happened next, Edwin saw only in fragmented pieces. The doctor's hands moved at her chest. Another man stepped forward, then immediately turned his face away, his shoulder blocking the lantern light. The doctor took a narrower iron tool, working it down through the stiff wool of the gray dress. The fabric resisted with a sharp snap of thread, and then it yielded. The doctor's forearms disappeared into the casket. Edwin's eye refused to settle on the work. He saw the doctor's heavy wool shoulders heave. He saw his father's knuckles tighten into white knots at his sides. He saw the lantern flicker as someone's shoulder passed in front of it. Then the sound, a wet, sickening crack. Under it, the slower sound of cartilage and tissue giving by degrees. The stone walls held the sounds and gave them back. The doctor's arm came up out of the casket. Something dark and thick was running down the inside of the wrist, slow, finding the small bones of the forearm and following them. It caught the lantern light along the way. It was the wrong color for what it should have been. Dark, glossy where it caught the yellow kerosene light. Thin black tendrils spread along the surface, fainter on the wet sheen than it had been on her cheeks, but the exact same shape, running all the way through the muscle. It moved the wrong way for what it should have been. A body 2 months in the cold should not have had anything in it that still moved. The doctor spoke again. George opened his eyes, but he kept them fixed on the floorboards. He nodded once. The men turned and went back out of the crypt, and the heavy door clicked into its frame. The vision shifted again. He stood near the flat granite slab beside the cemetery path. A small fire of pine knots had been built upon it. Edwin had not seen it catch. The doctor knelt in the snow beside the flames, the dark thing still held in his palms. He laid it directly onto the coals. The fire did not take it quickly. The surface hissed, resisting the heat, before yielding by slow degrees. Then it began to give off a heavy, dense smoke that was not the smell of meat or fat. The smoke was sweet. It went straight up into the leaden sky, a solid gray column. Edwin watched it go. The townsmen stood with their arms crossed against the frost, none of them looking toward the small fire. The smoke kept rising. He was at the edge of the woods, and the sweet smoke from the pine slab reached him in both places at once. The scent was the source of everything that had sat in the kitchen corners and the upstairs hall all winter, undiluted now, pouring through the open air. The smoke was in his throat. The smoke went into his lungs. The cough, like always, came up from below his ribs in one great hacking spasm that broke the dream to pieces. The pines vanished. The white drifts and the gray plume of smoke dissipated. Edwin was flat on his back in the downstairs room, his hand pressed hard against his mouth, the thick rush of fluid going between his fingers. When the spasm finally let go of him, he sank back. The pillow was damp against his ears. The handkerchief wadded in his fist was a small red weight. George came in then. He had been waiting just beyond the threshold. He came in fast, the doctor following close behind. A third man, a stranger from the town with snow still melting on his boots, stayed in the dark of the hallway. Edwin. His father's hand laid flat on his shoulder, putting down his full weight. Edwin, can you sit up? Here, take this. The cup was in the doctor's hand. It was a small, white ceramic mug. The water inside had been mixed with wild honey, but ashes had turned the liquid a thick, swirling gray. Edwin stared into the cup. He thought of the sweet smoke he had just been breathing on the hill. He thought of the small, dark thing in the doctor's palms at the flat stone. He thought of the veined branching on its surface. The cup was warm in his hand. He raised it to his mouth. The honey water touched his lips. He drank. I'm sorry, Mercy. A small handful of ash and honey water, no more than 3 swallows. He drank until the silt scraped against his teeth. Her grave was open, her body undone. This handful of ash was all that was left, and he was the place it was going to end. He set the empty cup on the bedside table. As he pulled his hand back, he saw it. A patch the size of a silver dollar on the back of his hand. The center was very dark, an even black violet without shine. From the center, thin dark cords spread outward under the skin in fine lines, not branching randomly but running with intention, some parallel, some crossing, some meeting each other and continuing on the other side. A small linked system laid down beneath the surface. The cords were the width of a horsehair. At the outer edge, the cords thinned to nothing and stopped a quarter inch into the clean skin. The dark did not sit on the skin. It sat under it. He could see the network through the top layer, the way the fine bones of a hand are visible through the back of it in a certain light. He turned the hand against the light, looking for a raised edge, looking for the place where the patch met the skin. There was no edge. The patch did not stop where his skin began. The patch was his skin. It had become part of the hand without his having known when. He turned the hand over. The palm was clean, pale, and dry. He turned it back. The patch remained. It did not hurt. It did not itch. He held the hand up in the gray light and looked at it for a long time. The fire is out now. The wind has gone quiet through the pines. The unhallowed hour is ended. Sleep well.